Thank you. It's now for something completely different. I want to begin with thanking Vera for the invitation to participate in the symposium. It is a privilege to be here, and it is moving to participate in this event, which pays tribute and commemorates and thinks about Gerda Lerner's legacy in a country from which he was forced out almost 90 years ago. The day and a half of investigation of her biography and actions show the dynamics and the complexities of her own personality and intellectual pursuits, but also of 20th efforts for rebirth from the ashes. The more recent reveal of the constancy of some of the deep structures that Gerda Lerner was positively fighting against is in itself a call to revisit and think with her work about the connections between history and activism. And so I thank you, Vera, for making the space for allowing us to think about these issues. I'm a medievalist, and my own work connects to Lerner's scholarly production by thin threads only. I was invited to speak today because of a confluence of events some 20 years ago. I admit that I found to my dismay that my memory isn't as good as it should be, a very eventful 20 years for me. But this need to jog my memory, together with the task allotted to me to think about Gerda Lerner's legacy or impact in Israel, led me to think about the meaning of scholarly impact and about the progression of feminist history, and specifically about how these materialize, as far as I can see, with respect to Gerda Lerner and my own research. I hope these rather personal thoughts, and maybe exotic in terms of the medieval aspects of them, will nevertheless resonate with you. In 2003, 2004, I was an exchange student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison under the extremely generous and, for me, life-changing George Mossey Fellowship. For many years, Mossey divided his time between Jerusalem and Madison, teaching both at the Hebrew University and at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His commitment to the two institutions was expressed in a bequest of funding that supported graduate students in an exchange program between these two institutions. As an early doctoral student trying to figure out her research trajectory, Madison was a pivotal place for me as a scholar. It was there my real education as a medievalist began. And I met Gerda Lerner there a couple of times in events dedicated to Mossey and to the older crew of emerita professors. I remember myself sitting timidly with her at the table and receiving inquisitively sharp questions, but I cannot recall exactly what they were. Though I think as the days progressed, I was thinking more it was there were some feminist questions, but mostly about politics. We shared the same unhappiness about the politics in Israel. I will go back to this later. In the following year, she received an honorary doctoral degree in Jerusalem. And as a Mossey Fellow, I was lucky to be entrusted with the task of organizing the events in her honor, in which Naama, one of the first Mossey exchange students, also presented her dissertation. She's there on the board. I'm not sure whether Gerda Lerner felt a particular special feeling in receiving that particular honor in Jerusalem. Though in these years she wrote more about her Jewishness, I was not sure Israel was particularly significant to her, and her disdain of the ongoing occupation and critique of Israeli government then rendered the event uneasy for her. We talked about it in Jerusalem. I cannot think what she would think today. Cannot bear to think. The honor itself seems also to phase her only little. After all, it was her 16th honorary degree. She told us she was planning on cutting the sashes from each and making a quilt from them. I still cannot decide if it was brilliantly ironic or a reveal of a Midwestern woman, grandmother persona she assumed after years in Madison. I'm inclined to think it was both, and that this duality also rang through in her visit in other ways. When Gerda Lerner came to Jerusalem, her words have been circulating and impacting scholarly field of women's history for at least 4 decades. Hearing her speak in person, the vigor of her words and combative style seemed to me and my friends who were organizing the conference with me, I was not alone, so they seemed to us both crucial and irrelevant to our own reality. A duality not unlike the one evoked by the sash quilt story. In the report of one of the main newspaper outlets in Israel, Haaretz, it was noted that Professor Lerner was receiving the honor late. The history of women was already an accepted desideratum by the teachers who did teach us about women, and they were now well on their way of newer gender and intersectionality, and were teaching more nuanced materials that seemed to us more current and were closer to the sources and less sweeping and patently agenda-driven narratives. My critique as a student of the pre-modern was that the task of uncovering the structures of patriarchy left little room for complexity and attention to context of actual people, and that was essentially a redemptive positivist history. I will return to this problematic judgment later on. At the same time, as is further noted in this article, there were only a handful of historians in Jerusalem and in Israel more broadly that actually taught or even addressed these topics. So there was a gap between the sophisticated, or what we thought was sophisticated and advanced feminist history taught, and the disengagement with the kind of history outside of our small milieu. We had one female professor who taught, one male professor who taught these topics, very, very few, and that was the case in most of Israel. And here is another incident that exemplifies this dynamic I am sharing with you. In effort to advance awareness to women's history, and in honor of Gerda Lerner, the Mossi Foundation funded a course on the topic of women's history for 3 years, and I was lucky to teach it twice. But my experience continued to carry a sense of duality. While the course was packed with students who were massively excited about the materials, as I casually happened to meet them, several of them over the years, I know that these courses left a mark, not because of my brilliant teaching abilities, but because of the materials. The professor in charge tried to convince me that in the department that the topic was not right for beginning students. It was first-year students coming into the university. And one actually asked me, after visiting the class and seeing the packed room, to change the course in the middle of the term and to turn it into a course about the medieval city. Now, 20 years later, I see some merit to his didactic argument of covering more thoroughly a more confined topic, and to what could have also been a valid feminist statement that women should not be discussed as part of a social and economic texture, that they should be discussed as part of a social and economic texture and not on their own. But knowing that specific professor, his mind was not set on instructing me about intersectional positioning, but who knows? In any case, at that time, it felt restrictive and close-minded. It must have also felt this way because there were so few female professors around. 20 years later, Israeli universities engage much more widely with histories of women, gender, and sexuality, and these topics are considered acceptable topics of research. The faculty in Israeli history departments is more diverse, though some less than others. In this sense, the seed that was planted in Gerda Lerner's drawing attention to the creation of patriarchy has altered consciousness and actively impacted the history profession in Israel, as it did globally. Looking back, I wonder how much of my perception then was colored by the critical snobbery of youth or its unaware optimism. I think in hindsight that I then thought that we achieved more, advanced more intellectually than we actually did in terms of achieving a new kind of discourse. In fact, I think the problem of the tension between grand narratives bound by agenda and edging and activism and the nuanced work of the historian that is bound to unsettled frames of thought has become more troublingly acute. The duty of arguing for overarching patterns, and specifically about the inherent inequality of patriarchal social structure in the current neo-traditionalist backlash, backed by the anti-humanist current, is to me clearer than ever. And yet at the same time, close case studies and the close source analysis provide important and nuanced attention to shifts in structures and, more importantly, to actual people and experiences. These cannot be reduced to binarism implied by times, by social construct as much as they govern life. In the remainder of this paper, I wish to complicate this inner dialogue a little more by focusing on one argument Lerner makes in her The Creation of Feminist Consciousness, and to bring into discussion with my current research on perinatal mental distress in the later Middle Ages. Told you, very, very different. In The Creation of Feminist Consciousness, Gerda Lerner took the European Middle Ages as an origin moment. It was in the 7th century, she claimed, that the first explicit expression of resistance to patriarchy were uttered. Lerner identified the church as having a pivotal role in this process, and we heard mentions of this yesterday. It was the church that provided some women with a space for personal expression by affording nuns, mystics, and laywomen a space for expression and intellectual growth. Through religious devotion, women without official capacity could claim authority. Another source of agency relied on motherhood. Motherhood, Lerner suggested, was the gateway form of formulating an idea of womanhood. It satisfied it as an alternative. It was an alternative knowledge based on education to that based on education or intellectual property. Though in her book, it is very obvious that intellectual learning is the higher kind of knowledge, and what she judges as feminism or feminist consciousness is always intellectual learning and not other kinds of knowledge. I think there's a very, very European understanding of what feminism should be. These forms of knowledge were open or only or mostly to men, women. The majority of them had experience, and in particularly bodily experience. Recognizing that a good portion, perhaps a third of medieval women, were never pregnant, percentage calculations are always sketchy for the period, but she does note that. Lerner suggests, nevertheless, that because of pregnancy and childbirth, because they were universal, embodied experience, they had a potential of being shared, relatable experiences of women, for women, and motherhood was an identity that was worth affirming and a category important in making women, lending women authority, allowing them to express themselves and to express control. Lerner doesn't delve into the role of motherhood in great detail. Of course, all of her engagement with the medieval is mainly based on what she learned from others. This was not her main attention, but she doesn't provide support for her claim that motherhood was the basis of communal support networks or was the basis of communal ritual. There is more than a touch here that was based on intuition. More recent research supports this, at least partially. Purification rituals in northern France and England celebrated childbirth and motherhood through religious ritual and could foster female communities. But we also know that the involvement of the church might also hint to a heavy hand of authorities' involvement in engendering and later monitoring these practices, making their internal female agency less obvious. So these practices that are celebrated as female and authority building are actually ways of monitoring women, and this ongoing discussion within medieval historiography about how we read them. While actual mothers were important to her analysis, more crucial to the rise of feminist consciousness was the Mother Queen of Heaven image that began to assume a prime place in the devotional landscape of the late 11th century. Following her colleague, John Kelly, Lerner regarded the rise of Marian devotion as a moment of cultural change by spreading a female motherly figure as the center of the period's devotion. She understood that the rise of liturgy, festivities, and shrines celebrating Mary as providing a female model and space in which women, albeit very specific, righteous, and chaste women, could become figures of devotion as potential fostering empowerment to women. So much like her understanding of the need of female professors, she understood in this way the position of Mary, fostering other modes of feminine authority. Lerner's argument, and to a degree also Kelly's argument, makes much sense. One would expect the devotional culture in which there is central female figure would instill in women a sense of confidence and inspire their devotional practices. Lerner sees this impact in the growing female mystical tradition that began with Hildegard of Bingen and the turn of the 12th century and continued with such as Catherine of Siena, Bridget of Sweden, Marjorie Kemp. There is women who obtain social recognition and even religious confirmation to obtain spiritual authority. While it is certainly possible to draw lines of impact from Mary to these women, the on-the-ground formation of female spirituality cannot be ascribed to it alone. In fact, chiefly and more importantly, mendicant devotionality, cities, the riches, the class, they are actually have a clearer line of impact. There were more immediate social, economic, and political contexts that permitted the rise of female spirituality. More importantly, when these are sufficiently acknowledged, it becomes clear that in many cases, these women were acting at the behest of men, being voiced by them, and this urges us to ask whether these examples actually point to the rising of feminist consciousness or to a regrouping, a restructuring of patriarchy, accommodating through these women its power. And the question then remains, how does patriarchy work and how does it shift? How does it change in bearing on life of actual women and men? And I want to tell you a story that exemplifies more clearly my own questions about how we tell the story of medieval patriarchy and its discontents. It is a story that we first encounter around 1120 in a compilation of stories involving Mary. So here's the story. There was once a woman named Morialdis, and she was the wife of a knight from Fecam in Belgium, now Belgium. One night during her pregnancy, she dreamed she was holding a vexillum, like a flag. How do you say that in English? Okay, a vexillum, does that work? You know, with the flag of a war, tainted with a color, sorry? Banner. A banner. Tainted with a color of blood. She awoke in distress and began speaking in a strange way. Her husband was surprised and didn't know what was going on. But unfortunately, her incoherence only worsened. The devil taunted her, and her Christian faith was faltering. The devil was after her soul. Fearing greatly for her, the knight and his friends began searching for a cure that would restore her mind. They took Morialdis to a nearby church dedicated to the Holy Trinity, most probably the one linked to the abbey in that village of Fecam, but to no avail. Many priests tried to exorcise her and to give her holy waters, but that too failed to alter her state. Finally, after a full year had passed, she was taken to a shrine dedicated to the Virgin. The shrine was remote, hidden in the forest, and fit for a hermit. Yet there, on the day of the Feast of the Purification, the woman was placed overnight and was finally healed. Mary's holiness, her role as Mother of God, and her own life experience were all at the root of Morialdis' healing. In some versions of this story, the sentiment was defined as granted to her by her son, but there too it is emphasized that it was Mary who was the active healer. So this story, written in 1120, goes back to what we can assume was a true story circulating on the ground and was collected in a compilation of news stories about Mary that all related to her miracles, and it started to circulate in England, and we have versions of this story, the same versions of this story being rewritten and recopied until the 17th century. Some of the people who copied it didn't like it all that much. This is William of Malmesbury, who read this very early, right after Anselm wrote it, and he says this is not a really good story. It doesn't evoke the heart. It doesn't burn with any kind of ecstasy for Mary, and we should put it aside. And he only cites a few lines of this story. So the culture of telling this story at the early 12th century was monk culture. Monk were telling these stories maybe around lunchtime to kind of a pastime of telling these stories. And this particular monk didn't find the story very helpful for his own devotional purposes. But the story kept on being circulated in other texts. And we find also translation of this story in other versions. And we know that it was possibly was meant to be read or told in purification rituals, which are a yearly celebration, but also in very personal purification that women would participate in after their own childbirth. And I want to just comment on two aspects this story raises that seem to me relevant to this question of patriarchy. The first is the role of Mary for women. So obviously what this story does, it allows a space for telling a story about a woman as a kind of a protagonist. She's not really a protagonist in the story. She's maybe more of a subject, but the story is about her and her body and about something that happens to her that we don't have much earlier evidence of women telling the story of storytelling about women's mental state after child or in childbirth or after childbirth. So this is one element that this new devotion to Mary allows these stories about women to be circulating, and it exposes the embodiment of women in a way that is importantly reflective of Mary and her body and how this relates to actual women. So there's this new discourse of women's bodies that comes with the devotion to Mary and it figures in the story. And another, and you can see here in this depiction, this is a 14th century manuscript in French, and you see that the main issue here is the woman devoted to Mary. This is not in the story, but this is what is left from this scenario for someone who is looking at it. What is important is there's this direct relationship between a woman, a devotee, and Mary. And you can see here another French version of the story, but it looks the most important element that this drawing alludes us to is something else different in the story, and that is the relationship of the community and particularly of the husband in this story to the woman. And I said that before that the woman is not the main protagonist. The main protagonist, of course, is Mary, and the second protagonist of the story is the husband. It is because of him in many ways that she becomes unsettled, but it is also him that is responsible in the story to take her and to heal her, to take her around for a whole year and to make sure that she's okay. And the fact that this story is told and retold over 400 years is a way, is a didactic, becomes a didactic tool of telling husbands how they should react if their wives during pregnancy and labor are experiencing an unsettling incident. It tells husbands that they need to care for their wives, even if it means going for a whole year around and just making sure that they are finding a remedy. And what we see when we look at the sources in archives, in miracle books and medical books, we see the involvement of husbands told and retold in the stories. And sometimes it is not very obvious what is really the husband doing, but there is a perpetual mention of the role of husbands, also the role of the community, but more than anything is the role of the husbands in caring for their wives. And I think if we look at this story, again, as a story, but as a didactic narrative that is supposed to teach people how to act, it shows us something different about the patriarchal relationships that is expected to be propagated. And just to finish off, I want to say what I tried to do here, maybe hopefully came across, is to look at something very, very different, but to say Gerda Lerner, in her Invention of Patriarchy, says, I know that much of the material that we find on the ground doesn't fit with my overarching statement about patriarchy. Men do collaborate with women. There are other instances and other manifestations of relationships that don't fall in with this grand narrative of the patriarchy. But I am set on telling you about the patriarchy mainly for having a very good narrative that can convince everyone, and you don't have to be bogged down by details, and you can remember it. But also because the agenda is more important than the actual people, and the overarching is more important than the people. And I think if we ask ourselves seriously, what does that do, both to activism and to history? If we think about the overarching rather than the people, what do we miss when we have that kind of narrative? Yeah, I hope this is clear. I'm done.